Okay, Module 34, Seven Deadly Sins, Part 1. A sin is a deliberate violation of a moral principle. Putting good people in bad places, context, is thus a sin. I'd like to tell you how I got onto this. This story's kind of interesting, I think. I wondered about bottom quintile teams, and I'd read in a book on psychology that people tend to attract people that are dysfunctional like them. The story that I read said that when you have a dance in a mental institution, fascinating thing happens that the two most dysfunctional people will meet up on the dance floor somehow unconsciously. So I thought that bottom quintile teams were attracting dysfunctional people. They started with a little core of people that were very low character, which is what IDAs basically measure, and attract the similar folks. So, when we have a question, we run a test. And it turns out that we have IDAs before workshops. So I had TDA data and IDA data. So I began to look at the correlation between IDA scores and team scores. And so my hypothesis was that what I thought I would see with a low benchmarking team, I thought I would see a clustering like this image of low IDA people. And I thought the correlation coefficient would be very high. That's R here. I thought it'd be close to 1 is what I thought. Well, this is what I got. Wow. So the hypothesis is clearly incorrect, and there is no relationship whatever. The R correlation coefficient is 0.3, and the correlation goes like R squared, so it's very weakly correlated. So there's some correlation. In fact, I would have been really worried if it were negative, but this small. So the hypothesis is not correct. So what is happening? I've got very experienced people working with many hundreds of teams over the years, and we began to look at things we commonly find. And the first one in the list is flawed team leadership. That will drive the team's whole team's scores down. So we talked before about the importance of the team leader. Here it is again. Second one is when the scope is far, far in excess of the money. The third is when you've got a flawed procurement process that's got the wrong people doing the wrong work with the wrong incentives. Another is a larger broken context. So if there's something going on in a larger organization like impending layoffs or stressors to do things that are impossible, that will tend to drive the team down. Power struggles, of course. When the personalities are grossly mismatched, this example shows a all-blue team trying to complete a late-phase project, doesn't work. Or when the organization's flawed and RAAs are not well identified, and especially accountability, as we've discussed so many times. So what do? When I do the work myself, and this is what I encourage everyone to do, I put the 7 deadly sins on a piece of paper, write them down. It's a one-pager. I recommend you get that. I'm sure it's in the user's handbook, and modify it to match the situation of your client and their business. Minor modifications. Probably some of the words need to be changed a little bit. And I put it down in front of the team leader and say, what's in play? And I say, how about team leadership? How effective do you think you are? And you'd be amazed at what people will tell you when they think you're there with a mindset of curiosity and caring. It's not that unusual. Someone will say to me, I really don't like working with people. I'd rather do technical work. I got promoted into this job because I'm really good as an engineer, and I'd really like to do something else. In that case, I'll go with them and work with the management and preserve their dignity and help them get a different job as a technical staff job. If they say they want to know, I say, well, let's go look at your IDA. Let's go see what it shows. That's a really good way to do it. And sometimes I might ask them, how would you feel if I asked the other team leaders how it's going? Other team members, sorry. Would you be okay with that? I'll never do that without asking. If they say, sure, go do a little informal survey and see what people think of how I run the place. It's all good. The second one's when the scope is far, far in excess of the money. This one I found an interesting way A vice president in industry said, I've got a guy who's incompetent running one of my big projects. And I said, oh, really? I said, let me do, like we always just do a TDA. I did the TDA, and TDA is in the bottom quintile, deep in the bottom. So I brought the team together and showed them the results. This was before the team leader was briefing them. This was long, probably 10 years ago. And I said, you know, well, can you tell me what's going on here? And they said, oh, yeah, it's real simple. You know, our company frequently lowballs costs. And what happened here was we had a typical lowball bid, and the vice president, who's now gone, cut the bid price in half. We won, and now the customer wants us to do it with that money, and it's impossible. So I did an IDA on the guy, went back to the vice president and said, you know, I'm sorry, but there's nothing wrong with this guy. The problem is the context. And he didn't like the answer, and I didn't do a lot more work for him, but that's okay. So what happens here, really interesting to me, is that people tend to think about the lack of money as risky in terms of the technical risk. But I think there's even more risk in the social context. So what you'll do, you drive a team down here, you'll have this context I've talked about before, unappreciated, conflict everywhere, people feel excluded and get angry, trust is low, blind optimism replaces reality, no one's committed to anything, you're full of victims and blamers, and nobody wants to take accountability. Then you have the technical risk, which I think everybody already understands and buys into. Don't need to convince you of that. This is an interesting chart of projects, and I think this was NASA projects, but this applies to everything. This will explain why big projects the governments do always overrun. What they're showing you here is just fascinating, that if you plot the cost, and this is in the logarithms of dollars, and the day we can do budgeting in logarithms of dollars may come someday, but until then, the money goes up with the log, and the complexity is linear. So you've got a very rapidly increasing function. Let's just take, for example, a complexity of 0.1 takes 10 units of cost. A complexity of 0.5 takes 120 units of cost. So it's a very rapidly rising function, and people don't get this right. And here's what's fascinating. They color-coded these things by whether they were successful, failed, or nearly failed. And then they put a line down the middle. Now look at every place they underfunded it. Look what happened. They got all these failures and all these under things. Every place they funded it properly and maybe did a little bit extra here, the things worked fine. This is a fascinating chart. Now, when you're working with a team with this problem, there's really only two things you can do. You can prepare them, and I tried to do this with the team in question, and the vice president, for whatever reason, didn't want to, but you can prepare a 4D request to the sponsor and tell them the truth, and I always urge that. And that should get you either more resources, or maybe they'll cancel the project, and maybe you're better off if they do, if it's that bad. Or you got to reduce the scope, and this is something you can only do in the early phase. As time goes on, it doesn't save any money to reduce scope too late. That's the first part of 7 Deadly Sins, and I'll pause here to keep this not too long and be back with you soon. Thank you, and take care.